This podcast represents the opinions of our hosts and their guests only. The content here should not be taken as medical advice and is for informational purposes only. And because each person is so unique, please consult your healthcare professional for any medical questions. Welcome to Once Shattered, Picking Up the Pieces. Linda Major, Jack Major, and Ellen Bennett are three fierce advocates, two moms and a dad who are passionate about changing the way eating disorders and mental illness are viewed in our society. Linda, Jack, and Ellen believe we need to stop the stigma, band together, and help people find resources and support early on. They advocate to foster awareness, enhance education, and improve treatment, as well as to help society understand and embrace individuals and families who are affected by eating disorders and all mental health conditions.
Welcome, everyone, to Once Shattered, Picking Up the Pieces, episode 108. Dr. Cynthia Bulik is our guest today, and we are going to be discussing genetic studies, anorexia, and all eating disorders. Cynthia Bulik is a clinical psychologist, and she is a Ph.D., FAED, and the founding director of the University of North Carolina Center of Excellence for Eating Disorders, distinguished professor of eating disorders at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and professor of nutrition in the Gillings School of Global Public Health. She is also professor of medical epidemiology and biostatistics and director of the Center for Eating Disorders Innovation at the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, Sweden. We are so honored to have her here today. And in order to get as much of the in-person Dr. Cynthia Bulik as possible, you can read the rest of her impressive bio and find links for this show in the show notes. And I strongly encourage you to do that. We welcome you, Cynthia, and we thank you for teaching us all. It's an honor to have you here.
Thank you so much, Linda. I'm really happy to be here with the three of you today.
Yeah, as Linda said, we're so grateful for you to be here today and for your compassion and your understanding and all your research going forward. Linda and I want to quickly thank you for the wonderful review of our book, Emily, the Story of a Girl and Her Family Hijacked by Anorexia, on Exchanges, the blog of the UNC, that's University of North Carolina Center for Excellence for Eating Disorders, that you did in December of 2020. It brought tears to our eyes. So your research is global and speaks volumes as eating disorders are prevalent in every city, state, and country. We recently were a girl from Slovakia reached out to us who saw our podcast recently. And, it's just...
The world is getting smaller.
Yeah. This is just, it's a worldwide problem.
Yes.
Cindy, your research has given me such hope for the future. I lost my daughter Katie to anorexia at age 25, and the Mazers lost their daughter Emily at age 35. We are passionate about stopping the stigma, starting the conversation, and improving treatment. We have a deep understanding of the importance of research and about your ongoing research. Research will shape future treatment and care, as well as expand our understanding of eating disorders and their complex nature. Welcome, welcome.
Thanks, Ellen.
Cindy, can you begin by sharing some of the findings of the Anorexia Nervosa Genetics Initiative, the ANGI study, and then tell us about the Eating Disorder Genetics Initiative, the EDGI study, which is currently enrolling participants now. We will keep any of our questions and comments brief because there is so much fascinating information for you to share and so little time. So start wherever you like, my dear.
Okay, I'll do that, Linda. Actually, your two families are the driving force behind what I do. It just It tears me apart bit by bit every time I hear about the loss of another child or partner or person to this illness. And I have never been satisfied with how people describe the illness, what they say causes the illness, and how to treat the illness since I started in this field in 1982. And it still pains me that we don't have answers. And I'm sorry to say that, yes, hope for the future. We still have to have that future word in there because we're not going to transfer our findings immediately into treatment, but we're going in that direction faster than we ever have before. So directly to Linda's question. So the tools that we use to study genetics have just rapidly advanced beyond where they were even a decade ago. This field it moves so fast that I can't keep up with the new methods, which is great because, my hope really lies with, the next step, how much more we can do, how much more a single blood spot or some saliva can tell us about a person's biology. And the Anorexia Nervosa Genetics Initiative, which was funded by the Klarman Family Foundation, was the largest genome-wide association study ever conducted for anorexia nervosa. And what that means is we actually got blood in that study because, back then when we did that study, 10 years ago, we still needed blood. And we got it from over almost 16,000 people with anorexia who had anorexia at any time in their life because your genes don't change, right? And then compared them to a large sample of people who didn't have anorexia nervosa. And what you basically do is you slather 1 million markers across the genome, you genotype everybody's DNA so we know your whole sequence, and then we compare them en masse. So we take the large group of people with anorexia with a large group of people without and ask the simple question, where are the differences? And we make that comparison very stringent to make sure we're not identifying false positives. We want to know that if we see a difference between someone with the illness and people without the illness, that's actually a real difference, because that means we're going to put energy and money and get our neuroscience colleagues involved with chasing up those findings. What are those genes? What do they do? How do they influence anorexia? And how can they lead us to better treatments? So what Angie found, the big finding, in addition to identifying 8 regions on the genome that are associated with anorexia, so contribute to it, we identified the fact that not only is anorexia firmly genetically related to other psychiatric disorders like obsessive compulsive disorders and depression, but we found that it's also genetically associated with metabolism and with anthropometrics. And, what that means is that some of the same genes that influence lipid metabolism, diabetes, insulin resistance, are also active in anorexia nervosa. It's not only a psychiatric illness, it is also a metabolic illness. And as you all know, we've been treating it primarily as just a psychiatric illness up until now. So I will stop there because I'm guessing you have some questions with just that intro.
That's amazing.
Yeah. Well, there's people we've met in the medical community who don't believe it's a psychiatric illness. They believe it's developmental illness. And, and I see that maybe when somebody's going through puberty and stuff that maybe, but as it becomes severe enduring anorexia, or the longer it goes, I can't accept that, because I know from our point with Emily was the most normal, quote unquote, little girl,
happy and
adolescent,
almost,
teenager. And I mean, hers developed later in her 20s.
Right.
But the change in her, the longer that anorexia got a hold of her, it just tore me apart because it wasn't my daughter. And it's like the people that were treating her treated her what they saw lying there, but they didn't treat the person inside. I just can't accept the fact that, And I asked that question once. So I understand somebody is a teenager and maybe it's not psychiatric, but the longer it goes and the brain's not getting the nutrition and it's changing, and I don't know, what's your feeling? I mean,
I think we draw these lines. Is it developmental or psychiatric? And I think the worst line that we draw is it somatic or physical or psychiatric? And, I spend most of my life trying to convince people not to say or, but to say and instead. And frankly, I don't think there is just one pathway into anorexia nervosa. And it can happen at any age. So yeah, sure, we can look at the role that development plays. In fact, sure, puberty is one of those times. And honestly, so is menopause. And, we're totally ignoring all of the women that are going through that transition and how that influences them. But these artificial lines between it's not this or it's not that, it's not psychological, it's physical. I just think that takes us down blind alleys instead of acknowledging that it's all those things in maybe different percentages for different people.
That's a good way. That's a good way to look at it. Different percentages for different people, and then it's not a slapped-on label.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
In fact, one of the things that we're looking at is, everybody doesn't have the same genetic predisposition to anorexia nervosa. And I'm going to take a minute to describe this because I think it's so important. There can be some people who have a high genetic predisposition and don't need a lot of environmental factor to sort of like push them over the line and develop the illness. Whereas other people who have a lower genetic predisposition might actually need more of those environmental insults before the disorder becomes manifest. And see, that's one of the things that we're really moving toward. We call it the Anorexia Nervosa Genetics Initiative or the Eating Disorders Genetics Initiative. But the richness of the studies are really in the fact that we're looking at both genes and environment and how they act and co-act to influence risk.
So all this research, does it get disseminated down into medical schools? Because there's so little training of physicians in medical schools, which I was so naive about 10, 15 years ago. I thought we'd bring Emily to the doctor and they would know how to treat her. And not realizing how little education they got. And I think it's getting better. But how does it get disseminated down to?
Yeah. Yeah, no, great question. And I would even go further. I would talk about medical school, nursing school, dental school, psychology school, all of the healthcare professions.
Yes.
Our medical students get, if they're lucky, one lecture in their 4 years. And if they're not at a place like UNC or one of the other major universities that has an eating disorder program, they will never see an eating disorder patient during their entire medical school career. So that's actually something that we're actively working on. The National Center of Excellence for Eating Disorders, which is directed by Christine Pete at UNC, is really working like mad to educate primary care physicians and other healthcare professionals about eating disorders. And they're also coming up with just a brief screener for primary care physicians so that they can ask those questions in a standard way and then know when it's time to refer and where. One of the things that we hear from PCPs is that sometimes they're afraid to ask questions about eating disorders because if the person says yes, they don't know what to do next. And I think you've all said that already, that you go to the doctors and they don't know, or the only thing that they've ever heard about are the shiny, glossy brochures from, for-profit programs, and they have no idea how to judge whether the treatment that they're getting for their child or their partner is actually evidence-based treatment. So we have a massive amount of work to do in this sphere in order to make sure that parents and patients can feel confident that they're getting the treatments that, right now today are the evidence-based interventions. Hopefully they will become better in the future. And, one of our goals is, again, to make our toolbox more rich so that we don't have a one-size-fits-all treatment. We can meet someone, we can, find out about their family history. We can maybe even look at their DNA. And we can start saying, you have a greater likelihood of responding to this treatment than to that treatment. So let's not waste our time with that one. Let's get you into this one first. And then figure out what we need to do after that if that treatment doesn't do what we hope it does.
That's incredible to think ahead and say that will be possible. I'm going to say, because it is so inspiring to think that there will be treatment management and plans will change based on this. The research that's happening now, it's so exciting.
Well, one of the things, mental illness now is in the forefront because of COVID now. And all these athletes, these tennis players, and I just saw an interview Sunday about a football player, and another football player is giving up his career to concentrate on his health and everything. And maybe naive and just my perspective. And until we get eating disorders into that conversation of mental health, then, because everybody's worried about anxiety and depression and schizophrenia, all that. But eating disorders should be in this conversation of mental health. You've written articles about how bad the treatment is of anorexia in this country. A crisis in treatment of anorexia nervosa. And we all know it in the eating disorder community or people that have lost children and stuff. But I just need to get it out there. We need to get it out to the public and politicians.
Yeah. No, Jack, I'm with you 100%. It's like, mental health was an orphan. I think at this point it's becoming less of an orphan because of COVID. And then we're like a double orphan. Eating disorders is the orphan of the orphan. I think some people call it the red-haired stepchild, but as a redhead, I feel not inclined to call it that. Well, former redhead, yeah. But it's again, and I think one of the pluses of the results from Angie is, yes, we're getting out there as a psychiatric illness, but we're also making other physicians aware that we need them to come on board and help us understand the metabolic aspect of this as well. And you folks have been through this with your children, but one of the things that I'm trying to understand is why people prone to anorexia nervosa find starvation so reinforcing. And one of the things that we're trying to understand and some work we're doing in Sweden as well is what actually is going on biologically with them, that when they go on that first diet or if they're in that first period of negative energy balance where they're expending more energy than they're taking in terms of food, does that seem to make them feel better? Does that tend to sort of calm whatever turbulence they have inside? But most of us biologically don't like being hungry, and we don't like starving. And we are biologically compelled to start foraging for food. It's like, where's the candy bar? If you're missing lunch, you need to get glucose to your brain fast. But especially in the early stages of anorexia, people tell us that they feel better when they're starving. And that makes it really hard to treat because our treatments make them feel worse. And I know you've all seen this with your children. As a clinician, I think this is why a lot of clinicians don't like working with eating disorders. If you work with depression, you take someone's depression away, they're happy. You take someone's social phobia or social anxiety disorder away, they're happy. You take someone's anorexia away, and they're not happy. They feel miserable. And that's the piece of the biology that I think is the key. Once we can figure out what that is, that's going to be where we need to intervene to change that so it doesn't feel so good anymore to starve.
We'll let you go on a little bit now. I know there's so much you have to share with us, but I just can't tell you how wonderful it feels to talk to people who truly understand. And speaking to you, you're the foremost researcher for eating disorders, and I just can't tell you what a profound impact that has on me, and that has already had on the community and people's understanding. It's just, we're so grateful for you. Just wish it happened sooner. That's all.
I know. I was just going to say the exact same thing, Linda. It's like, if we could just roll back time, for all of your daughters and I don't know, at this point, I don't know that the tools that we have now, are they better? I'm not so sure. I think in some ways we've gone backwards. And I think the article that Walt Kay and I wrote about the closing of a lot of university-based medical centers is frightening to me, because we're working like crazy here on the research side to try to advance things. And then we're like, who's the next generation of people going to be who take it over, who carry this research forward, who translate it into new treatments? We need to figure out a way so that this doesn't just become sort of a private sector industry, but it continues to be a important and central field of research and medical treatment.
And I will say just one thing, that oftentimes treatment feels punitive. And it needs to be very special, dedicated people. Certainly, they're complex diseases and complicated, but you need the right people that can connect and show compassion and realize that this is not a choice, that nobody would choose this. Right. And there are some very dedicated, wonderful people out there, but we have a long way to go. As I say, we're making ripples and we need waves.
Right. Or tsunamis.
Yeah.
And actually, I'll tell you about one innovation. I have this amazing good fortune to have, worked in eating disorders on 3 different continents, in New Zealand, in Sweden, and here. And in Sweden, we were able to develop this new approach to treatment. I mean, it was really a game changer where, and of course, it's socialized medicine, and I can't imagine it happening here. But we were able to reserve 2 beds in the inpatient unit for patients to return to whenever they felt like they needed to. And they made a contract with the treatment team, so they were known to the treatment team. Most had severe and enduring anorexia nervosa, but they also knew that they could come in, no questions asked, could stay up to a week, could decide if they wanted to transition over to regular care. But it could be because their dog died. It could be because of a breakup in a relationship. It could be because they were just feeling more fragile and felt themselves starting to slip or doing poorly. And what we observed in these folks is that it gave them agency over their own illness. It gave them responsibility for looking at themselves, evaluating how they were doing, and saying, hey, I think I need a booster. And watching them take ownership of their own illness was so powerful. And just data-wise, it ended up being actually cheaper because they had fewer emergency room visits, they had fewer long-term hospital visits, and they didn't necessarily gain more weight, but they were less ill. And I loved that program. And then we were able to show it to the government and say, look, this works. And they were like, okay, then you can keep those 2 beds. And sometimes I think about talking to insurance companies about that here, and my head explodes because I know they would just never go for anything like that. But it was so humane. It's just such a humane way. And Jack, you said this in the beginning. It actually speaks to the person inside. It speaks to them as a human being, not as an illness. and it acknowledges that they have somewhere. It helps pull out their own responsibility to themselves.
Right. And people often say, she's anorexic. Well, you don't say somebody, well, she's cancer.
Right.
Just
don't get me started on that one. I could go for an extra hour on, calling people by their disorders. Yeah.
All right. Tell us some more, Cindy. Go wherever you want.
Okay. Well, I'll go back to your first question because you started with Angie and then asked about edgy. So I will just sort of transition into what we're doing now. So we started out with anorexia, but that's not the only eating disorder. And we also know that many people with eating disorders sort of crisscross their way across different presentations during the course of their illness. So edgy includes, we're doing the same thing, only we can use saliva now. And that is anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, and binge eating disorder. And the National Institute of Mental Health is funding EDGI in the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and Denmark. But the really cool thing is we have brought on Sweden, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands is coming, Italy just got final approval, Mexico is going to be starting in a couple weeks. And we have other countries that are sort of like just getting ready and in line to start their own EDGIs. So we have globalized this. And within the United States, we're also taking extraordinary steps. Everything's available in English and Spanish. And we're making sure that we actually have representation from all of the people who have eating disorders, regardless of their body shape and size, regardless of their ancestry or their race or their ethnicity or their gender. And this is going to be the biggest study ever. We're aiming for 100,000 participants across the world. So it's a massive effort. It is my life. I eat, breathe, and sleep edgy right now. But it's been amazing to just get this buy-in from around the world. And we're trying to spread the message now. It's really actually interesting. New Zealand, Australia, Sweden, the desire that people have to give back and to contribute to the sort of global good is amazing. We have such positive response in those three countries. In Sweden, in like the first 2 weeks we were open in Sweden, we surpassed our US numbers and we had already been open for half a year. And I think that's just because they're so used to saying, sure, if I can help somebody else, I'll do it. And we're struggling in the States. We really have to push. We have to advertise. We have to get that website out there, which happens to be edgi.org for anybody who's interested. But I think we don't have that same mentality here that some of these other countries have. So it's a struggle. We're working hard to get everybody who's ever had an eating disorder at any time. All it takes is everything is online. So we have online questionnaires. We send you a little spit kit in the mail. You spit into it, close it back up, pop it into the mailbox. It's super easy. Everything is online. And then we take it from there. We extract your DNA from your saliva and we do the genotyping. And the bigger and bigger these samples get, the stronger and more robust our answers are going to be.
Do you want a sample from a 69-year-old male?
We've got them. It's so interesting. Yeah. We have people of all ages and all backgrounds who want to participate in this research.
I participated in the Angie study. So I sent my blood in, as a non-diagnosed. And it happened about 8 years ago when I saw the information. And it was because I was directly impacted. That opportunity to be part of something was so empowering. And so I encourage anyone out there who's been diagnosed to participate in the EDGI study. It is groundbreaking research.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yep. And you don't have to even have been diagnosed because We know so many people who have had these illnesses who have never been diagnosed or never been in treatment. So if you think you've had an eating disorder, we have a questionnaire in the beginning. And that's all that matters. I mean, a study that we just did for binge eating disorder, only 25% of people with binge eating disorder have ever sought treatment. Mm-hmm. So there are tons of people out there either who don't realize they're ill, don't have access to care, don't have the funds to afford care, a huge unmet need in terms of treatment.
Yeah, I just wrote something this morning on LinkedIn, something I replied to, and it was about not having the funds. I mean, residential treatments are upwards to $50,000 a month.
Well, it's also people are still going to doctors and being misdiagnosed.
Yeah.
It's frightening that it goes back to that awareness and understanding of eating disorders, the screening mechanism, and all of that, so that people don't know what to do. They think something's wrong. They know something's wrong.
Yeah.
As far as the EDGI study, do you have any idea when it will culminate? Are you just waiting to hit a certain number, or is there a timeline deadline?
Yeah, both of those things are true. So we have another year and a half of when we'll be collecting and enrolling new participants. So what's time? I mean, time doesn't even make sense anymore. So this is, we're in November. Yeah, so we have another year and a half where we will be collecting samples. And then in the meantime, in the background, we're already working on the data that are coming in from all of the questionnaires. Because one of the things we're doing in EDGI that also makes it sort of bigger than ANGI is the questionnaires aren't just about eating disorders. So we included questionnaires about depression and anxiety and substance use and alcohol use and trauma and physical activity and obsessive compulsive symptoms. So we're really trying to look at the whole sort of package that we often see people with eating disorders present with. And the really interesting thing about that is we can then collaborate with other groups. So our group is the Eating Disorders Working Group of the Psychiatric Genomics Consortium. The PGC, Psychiatric Genomics Consortium, is the biggest collaboration in the history of psychiatry. There are like 800 of us in this consortium. I'm the founder and one of the co-chairs of the eating disorders group, but there's a substance abuse group, a PTSD group, an OCD group, an anxiety disorders group. So they're doing the same thing we're doing in these other disorders. Wow. And then when we collaborate and put our data together, then we can start seeing like which genes influence both anxiety and eating disorders. Are there differences of people with eating disorders who have higher genetic predisposition for anxiety than those who may have higher genetic predisposition for substance use disorders, for example? So, we're really going to be able to get down into the sort of comorbidity and cross disorder patterns as well, once we get all these data collected.
Oh, that's so important. So important, because people don't realize the comorbidities that people with eating disorders have.
Yep.
So I could get involved in the study?
Sure. You know where to find me.
I do. So getting back to Sweden and residential costs, how does it work over there if somebody, is in the hospital and they have to go to residential?
Well, they don't have, residential is something that is uniquely American.
Okay.
Yeah. So, but the government pays for your inpatient treatment. I had the unfortunate, it was an interesting learning experience. I had to be just hospitalized for one night in Sweden for something. And I just, with my American mindset on, I imagined like this humongous bill that has a million line items, half of which I don't understand. And no bill ever came. And it's because it's covered by your taxes. And it was great care. And people with eating disorders right now, in Sweden, the waiting lists are long. And that's because just like here, the pandemic has really led to a lot more, people either needing treatment for eating disorders, depression, anxiety, substance use disorder. Although I read an interesting article that suggested that alcohol use has gone down in college age students, but marijuana use has gone up. And my bet is because they can't go out to the bars, right, to drink socially, but within the confines of their dorm room, they're able to smoke.
Interesting. You mentioned New Zealand and girl in New Zealand, Christy Amadeo, who is starting to open hopefully opening a residential treatment center there, not for profit, in next year. So she's wonderful. I reached out to her after I saw her TED Talk about her recovery, and she's been a big advocate for us and what we're trying to do. The story we put out there, I keep telling people, everybody needs to tell their story, because just like, with this mental illness, you get all these athletes out there and everybody, it's terrible and it's good they're taking care of themselves. And the famous people, I always say this, the famous people that something affects, and Karen Carpenter was the first person we knew famous. And everybody says it's terrible, but it's terrible what happened to Ellen. Katie was a life. Emily was a life. And they weren't famous, but it devastates a family. And that's why I'm trying to get people to just tell their story. And so everybody knows how many stories are out there like ours that nobody ever hears. And hopefully if the people start hearing enough, something will change. And again, it's got to get down to the insurance industry ultimately. Right. Because even if the doctors are on board, they've got to make that phone call to the insurance industry. So it's a big mountain to climb, I understand, but we need to keep trying to get to the top.
No, I agree. And I was just going to add to that, the other people who really respond to stories are politicians. I could go up to Capitol Hill and spout out numbers and data and statistics until I'm blue in the face. But what really gets them to act is to hear stories like yours. To talk about, to have families be there who talk about having lost a child or a partner who had lost their partner. And it's hard. It's so hard. But when we go up to Capitol Hill or do it virtually with the Eating Disorders Coalition, it's the stories that make a difference.
And we've all done that here, and we believe in it. I've only been to Washington. We've been once, but Ellen, you were a couple times.
DC quite as often as we could until COVID.
But we do local and we do Albany. And
powerful.
It is, but there's just so many causes out there, and they're all worthy. And it's just that this cause just is so underfunded and underdiagnosed. I mean, when you say one person dies every
52
minutes from an eating disorder, I'm sure it's far more than that because so many people aren't diagnosed.
Right.
And you talk about evidence-based treatment and the way we treat eating disorders here. I know that connection is so important, but is there research going on here now with different methods of treating people? Because it seems like it's the same treatment that people have been getting since the 80s, right? Since Karen Carpenter, right?
Yeah. And, as you know, there are still no FDA-approved medications for anorexia nervosa, and frankly, nothing that works.
Right.
And that's really where we're hoping this research is going to make a difference. It's pretty hard to develop a drug for something if you don't understand its biology. I mean, granted, there are serendipitous findings that have happened in lots of fields where medications have suddenly worked and people were just trying them for one reason or another. But it sure is better if you actually can have something in the biology that you plan to target and then work from that biology toward the medication. And I think that gets back to what I was saying before, that hopefully we'll be able to target that metabolic piece and whatever it is that makes starvation reinforcing. Because I think that when you really think to the fundamental core of what is this, it's that people with anorexia nervosa can starve themselves and they feel better. They feel like they benefit from starving themselves. That is the core thing biologically that differs from them. And I think that switch that you talked about, Jack, when you were saying, this was my daughter one day, and then when anorexia got a strong hold, she became a different person. There's something about that switch. Mm-hmm. And some parents say it happens like almost overnight. And then they can see it if it's coming back again. If there's a relapse, they can just see that sort of like the aura or the prodrome that this is about to happen again.
And so many people think about the social factors in people developing an eating disorder, but there's a book called Holy Anorexia, and they believe, many of the saints who fasted became anorexia, and that was that same trigger way back then. And not far from here, there's a Amish community, a young girl that I met and like very much, and she's a friend now, told me that in their community, there's a huge problem with eating disorders, and they have started their own center, and it's amazing. And they were able to do it more outside of the medical community because it's just for people who are Amish or Mennonite. It's called Peaceful Meadows, and it's in Geneva, which actually is where I grew up. And it's beautiful, and they did it in 6 months. And yes, there certainly are regulations that they have to follow, but it's because of
no insurance.
No insurance. They're able to do it for a fraction of what people pay. Just a incredible fraction.
Well, and their community comes together and helps other people with the money. I mean, people from when they wanted to build this center and they put out the call, people from Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New York all came together and got this beautiful place built in 6 months and up and running. That's incredible.
But, they're so removed from our culture there. I'm sure our culture affects them, but if it was just culture, there would be nobody who was Amish or Mennonite who got an eating disorder. So when I talk to people about these things, they're just in awe. And so I just think that the awareness and the education and is essential in just getting people to look at it differently. And it's great that all mental illnesses are being looked at and accepted more because we're all struggling with things. There's mental illness of some form in every family, and it's nothing to be ashamed of. I just can't stress that enough.
I just wanted to go back to your religious comment as well. And St. Catherine of Siena, obviously, that the core is the same. The packaging is different. When you look at the saints, it's just that stuff that's around it. It was in the name of holiness and purity and closer to God. And now, people think it's more the, thin ideal or, trying to be buff or ripped if you're a guy. But I spoke with a fascinating woman I did a documentary with her, and she was Muslim, and she talked about the impact of Ramadan on her anorexia. And it was the fasting that actually prompted her anorexia in the beginning. And when the rest of her family was all excited for sundown and it was time to eat, she was raring to go. She just wanted to keep fasting. So we've ended up having to work with rabbis and with priests and with all sorts of religious leaders to get them to excuse people who have eating disorders from obligatory fasts because it's such a risk factor. But her case was really interesting because it didn't have any of those like social trappings from today. It was like an old case that was more related to fasting and purity and religion. But it doesn't matter what the packaging is, the core is still the same.
Well, I just wish the treatment wouldn't be so cookie cutter. And I know it's all because of insurances, and I understand we need to restore people's weight to when they're really...
But they restore weight so quickly, and I know that's insurance driven, but my little mind, I just think that it should just be much more gradual if it's going to be lasting. Just like, it's not healthy, to go on a crash diet. It's not healthy to diet anyway. But, just to try to be healthy and eat more when they haven't eaten for so long, it's such a struggle. And just to get used to your body changing, I just think it should be much more gradual. But it's so prohibitively expensive to get care. I understand that, but we just have to do better. But
because it's all about, it's about control, and they need some control over what they're going to eat. I mean, they can't. I remember Emily saying, she had to eat 3,000 or 4,000 calories a day. And I don't eat 3,000 or 4,000 calories some day.
Yeah, it's hard work. It's hard work.
And it's hard work. And these people fear food. And now you're asking them, it doesn't make any sense to me. And again, I'm not in that community. I'm not a medical person. I'm a pharmacist, so it's nowhere near to understand it. But it just doesn't make sense to me.
The severe and enduring, I think, jumps into this whole other category. And I remember one of the doctors saying to me, your daughter's brain was hijacked by the eating disorder. And I reflect back on that, and I think that was oddly clarifying for me. When I reflect back, I'm like, oh God, how does something like that? And he said it was like dealing with a terrorist, and it's like, you're helping me understand. But now with this conversation, that's the switch. It's that switch, and why it is so important to get a handle on that. And how important this research is, because we've got to know what is it that flips, and then how do we get that recovery?
Right.
Yeah.
How do you get it unflipped once it goes there?
So, can I ask you a question about what drew you into working with these difficult patients who are such wonderful, compassionate people? I will say that the people affected by these diseases are the most wonderful, compassionate, bright people, and it just gets difficult when they're in physical and emotional pain. So
yeah, absolutely. I actually started out in childhood depression, and a colleague of mine, my mentor at the time, needed to write a chapter and didn't have time to do it. And the chapter was comparing some biological indices in anorexia and depression. And I was like, David, I don't know anything about anorexia. And he's like, well, go shadow the psychiatrist on the eating disorders. This was up in Pittsburgh. And I shadowed George Shue was the attending, and I shadowed him for a couple weeks and got fascinated. At that time I was young, and everybody in the unit was like my age. And I was also a competitive figure skater. And my two worlds sort of collided right there, because I realized that I had been surrounded by this. There were kids at the rink who would sort of disappear. I realized later there were kids that I skated with who vomited all the time before their lessons because they didn't want their coach to shame them. And I was like, my God, this is everywhere. And that's sort of like that. The train was out of the station at that point. And it's been going ever since, because, and I still get emails and Facebook messages from people I knew when I was younger who say, you didn't know this, but, I had an eating disorder the whole time we were in school together, and nobody ever recognized it. And needless to say, it just breaks my heart.
Yeah. Through our travels, our advocacy locally with politicians, Albany and the one time in Washington, and I know Ellen's seen this too. Everybody knows somebody. You sit down and talk to a politician himself or their aides, or
you get on a bus or an airplane and sit next to somebody, and it's just it's much more prevalent than people realize.
That's so true. Yeah, sometimes people will say to me, I don't really know anybody with an eating disorder. I'm like, oh, yes, you do.
So the Stripe study that shows how much it's costing the society, $65 billion in this country alone, right? I mean, that's something that should open the eyes of politicians. That's what they
Right.
Certainly look at the cost of money.
Yep.
And,
Yep.
and I always said Ellen's daughter, Katie, was working, contributing to society, and Emily the same, and had many, many years ahead of them to do the same. And Emily ended up on, Social Security disability and Medicaid, taking from the system. And she'd gotten the treatment early on. She might have recovered enough to continue to work.
I have a full life.
And have a full life.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we're community advisory board members on the Western New York Comprehensive Care Center for Eating Disorders. Mary Tantillo and Dr. Cripey up here, and they have Project Echo, which I think is invaluable. The grant they get from the state, and they do Project Echo that reaches.
They do a medical one,
de-identified cases, and to anybody that wants to zoom in, and then they do it to schools too.
Right. So there's a medical one, and then there's the one for schools. And even if you're the lunch lady, which makes a whole lot of sense, you can zoom in, right? And I think those are great. Yeah. Well, we're kind of running out of time here. We could talk to you for hours. I'd love to have you for dinner, but I know you're very busy. Is there anything that you would like to share with us before we get ready to wind down here?
I think I'd just like to, wherever they are, sort of, and I don't want to make you feel bad, but I just want to reach out to Emily and to Katie, and just make sure that they know that there are a lot of us out there that are working really, really hard, so that other people don't have to go down that same path. And as parents, I just want you to know that my heart really does go out to you. And I am sorry that this field has not progressed further sooner so that we could have done more for your daughters.
Thank you for your compassion and for all that you're doing.
What is happening now with your research and the previous research and the Stripe report, I think it's just absolutely groundbreaking for moving things forward. So my question is, when will results from the EDGI study be available? I know it's not an exact thing, but just having a general idea, because I am somebody who's sitting, waiting to hear more. I need it. I need the information.
Well, I'll give you some good news. I mean, there will actually never be final results because we're going to keep growing this over time. So believe me, I'm not stopping when we're going to get more funds and more countries and more DNA. Because, depression has over 1 million people, right? I mean, we're actually far behind the 8 ball, as eating disorders usually are. We have another paper and a set of analyses that we're working on now that will come out in 2022. So we'll be able to give you a little bit to get excited about in 2022. And then EDGI will keep going, and there will be another one. This really does evolve. And we will continue it moving forward. And we've got some awesome junior people who are going to be taking this over, in the future. So the PGCED, the Eating Disorders Group, we have 200 people from around the world involved with this research. So, so I promise you will probably have a big paper every year to give you some more hope.
That alone is such incredible information. To know that it's going to be ongoing and more and that data is so expansive that from my position as somebody who's lost, this is what pushes us forward. Yeah. It's what gets us to start the conversation and say, we got to talk about this. We have to have this information. We've got to advocate. And
this keeps us going.
I am so grateful for all that you're doing with this research. It is.
Thanks, Ellen.
Yes.
And hopefully, it will make all this shame stuff go away.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
That's the part that it's like, you're not ashamed if you have asthma. You're not ashamed if you have type 1 diabetes. Why
Right.
are we still shaming people for having eating disorders or families?
Mm-hmm.
That's another hour-long conversation.
Yeah.
Another topic.
We're hosting our first meeting for parents of adults with eating disorders, and it's just
parents,
it's
loved
just-
ones,
it's-
spouses.
you know,
Yeah.
it's just the three of us sitting down and having a chat, whatever they want to say, whatever they want, and because we wish there was something out
Like that
there
for us.
Yes.
years ago,
Yes.
like on an island. So there's only like 3 or 4 people signed up, but that's fine. You know,
That's
they
a
can
start.
come and
Yeah.
they can talk and they can vent and they.
Yep.
So,
And there's
That's awesome.
and there's an art therapist, and we're using her studio, and we're going to be doing all different activities. But we're very grateful for Sarah Barron at the Spotted Rabbit Art Studio for letting us host our first meeting there. So
That's wonderful. Oh, good luck. I hope it goes well.
yeah,
Thank you.
we do too.
And
It's been
thank
a
you
big day.
thank you for sharing your precious time with us. We know how busy you are, and thank all our listeners for tuning in today. And please help us spread the word. Subscribe, share, rate, and review this Once Shattered, Picking Up the Pieces podcast on the platform you're listening to us on. And again, Cindy, thank you so much. Bless you.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Well, people, let's start the conversation and spread the word about the Eating Disorder Genetics Initiative. Be a participant. Join this study.
Thank you so much, Cindy. You're a hero and a shero, and you have angels wings and worldwide support from the eating disorder community and so many more. I assure you, you are held in the highest esteem from every angel who lost their battle with an eating disorder and all who love them. And we're so, so grateful for everything you do. Wish Emily and Katie could have known you. And one more person I need to thank. Thank you, Rockvox Recording and Production, and our wonderful sound engineer, Scott Fitzgerald, for expertly producing this podcast. Thank you, everybody. Thank
Bye.
you, Cindy. God bless you. So
Thank you so
grateful.
much.
Such an honor.